This video is a continuation of section 1.4. This video is on the topic of completing the square. Now, all of these videos in this section are on quadratic equations and a variety of methods to solve them. We've looked at the zero factor property and the square root property. And those two properties will work only in certain instances. So the zero factor property will only work when my quadratic expression is factorable. So if it won't factor, the zero factor property is not going to help me. And the square root property is really just a shorter way or a faster way to solve the equation because there's only a square term and a number. Now, these next two methods can be used on any quadratic equations. Even if it will factor, even if the square root property works, these two methods will work. The first of those methods is completing the square. So to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square, remember the number in front of x squared is always a. The number in front of the x term, or the variable that has an exponent of 1, is always b, and then c is always the constant. So a is the coefficient of my square term, b is the coefficient of my variable raised to the first power, c is my constant. Make sure it's set equal to 0. And remember that is standard form. Alright, so step 1 says if a does not equal 1, then you want to divide each side of the equation by that number. So if a is something other than 1, you have to divide everything by a. Once that is completed, you're going to rewrite the equation so that the constant term is alone on one side. So it doesn't matter which side, but usually the way that it's written, it's easiest to put the c over where the 0 would be on the right side. But it doesn't matter which side you put it on, as long as it's by itself. Then what you're going to do is take half of b, so either divide b by 2 or multiply it by 1/2. Once you get that, you square it. Then you're going to add this square to each side of the equation. What you have then on the left side, or whichever side you decide to keep your variables on, will be a perfect square trinomial, which you can easily factor. And then you'll use the square root property to find the solution. So I know that sounds like a lot, and maybe a little confusing, but maybe once you see some examples, it'll make more sense. Alright. The first example, x squared plus 10x minus 20 equals 0. So the first thing I look at is a. A is 1, so there's nothing I need to divide, so I can go ahead and move to step 2, which says rewrite the equation so the constant term is alone on one side. So what I'm going to do is take this 20, and I'm going to move it over here where the 0 is. So now I have x squared plus 10x, and then leave a little space there because we're going to put some numbers there. And when I cross that equal sign with that negative 20, it becomes positive 20. Okay, so all we did was take the constant and move it to the other side of the equal sign. Once you cross the equal sign, it changes sign, so from a negative to a positive 20. Alright, step number 3 says square half the coefficient of x. So here's the coefficient of x. That would be 10. And to square the half, so what I'm going to do is find half by either dividing by 2 or multiplying by 1/2, whichever way you want to do it. Alright, and that gives me 5. Alright, we're going to use this 5 again, so keep it in mind, but first we're going to square it. And then that gives me 25. Now I'm going to take this 25 and I'm going to add it to both sides. So now, this right here is a perfect square trinomial. I can then write it as x plus, and then whatever you got when you took half of that middle term. So when I took half of 10, I got 5. That's the number that's going to go here. Alright, and then squared. So if you multiplied x plus 5 times x plus 5, you would get this trinomial here. Alright, For me, it's just easier to remember the variable this operator, and then whatever I got when I took half is the number that goes there. Alright, equals 45. Now when I take the square root of both sides, remember the square root property says to do plus or minus. So we would now have x plus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 45. I can simplify 45 into 9 times 5, which would be 3 square roots of 5. Remember, if you need help with simplifying these radicals, simplifying these square roots, come see me in my office or go to the Learning Lab and get some help. Alright, so now we have x plus 5 equals plus or minus 3 square roots of 5. I still need to get x by itself, so I'm going to subtract 5. Alright, the answer would be x equals negative 5 plus or minus 3 square roots of 5. And I would have two answers, negative 5 plus 3 square roots of 5 and negative 5 minus 3 square roots of 5. Notice there are no decimals in my answer. Okay, let's look at this one here. I want to complete the square again. Ignore that right there. Alright, because this one is a does still equal 1. Let's see, there we go. Alright, so when I look at a, it is 1. So I don't have to worry about step number 1. Step number 2 says take the constant and put it on one side by itself. So I'm going to take this 6 and move it over with the 0. When I cross the equal sign, that positive 6 becomes negative 6. Now I'm going to take b, which is here. I'm going to take half of that. So I'm going to divide it by 2. Alright, if it comes out to be a decimal in your calculator, just leave it as a simplified fraction, which would still be 5 halves, and then square it. And then we're going to add that to both sides. So 5 squared is 25, 2 squared is 4. We're going to add that to both sides. Alright, now when I factor this, alright, it should always be a binomial squared, my variable, my plus sign, what I got when I took half, or what go inside the parentheses squared. Alright, and then negative 6 plus 25 fourths. If you put that in your calculator, I believe you should get 1/4. I believe negative 1/4, because that'll be negative 24. Negative 1/4. Just put it in your calculator and let it handle the fractions. Now, and that is not right, it should be positive. I was right to begin with. Positive 1/4. We're going to take the square root of both sides. So we'll have x plus 5 halves equals plus or minus 1/2. The square root of 1 is 1, the square root of 4 is 2. Then I'm going to subtract 5 halves from both sides. So I'll have x equals plus or minus 1/2 minus 5 halves. Now this you can combine together to find the two answers that x equals. So I'm going to say x equals 1/2 minus 5 halves. Would be negative 4 halves, which is negative 2. Then I'm going to say x equals negative 1/2 minus 5 halves, which would be negative 6 halves, which is negative 3.